The alarm screamed through the small research vessel as Daniel Carter fought with the controls, his hands moving fast across the panel that sparked and smoked in front of him. The ship shaking so hard, his teeth rattled and his vision blurred with each violent impact against the atmosphere of the planet below. "Come on. Come on," he said through gritted teeth, pulling back on the manual override lever that groaned under the strain. The automated systems completely dead after whatever had hit them in orbit, maybe debris or maybe something worse. But it didn't matter now because the ground was rushing up to meet him, and he had. Maybe 30 seconds before impact, the vessel screamed as it tore through clouds that looked thick and wrong, colored in shades of purple and green that no Earth sky had ever shown. And Daniel caught glimpses of the surface below through breaks in the atmospheric murk. Jagged mountains and dark forests, and nothing that looked even remotely safe for a crash landing. 20 seconds, and the heat shields were failing. The cabin temperature rising fast enough that sweat poured down his face and soaked through his uniform. His fingers slipping on the controls as he tried to angle the nose up just a little more. Just enough to maybe survive the impact instead of becoming a crater. 15 seconds, and he saw a clearing ahead. Small and rough, but better than the alternatives. So he aimed for it and prayed to gods he didn't believe in and held on as the ship hit the treetops with a sound like the universe. Tearing apart, the world became chaos and noise and pain as the vessel plowed through massive trees that were harder than any wood Daniel had ever known. Each impact throwing him against the harness that cut into his shoulders and chest. Equipment breaking loose and flying through the cabin like deadly missiles. Then, the ground and everything stopped. Daniel hung in the harness for a long moment, barely breathing, his ears ringing and his body reporting pain from what felt like everywhere at once. But he was alive, and that was more than he had expected 10 seconds ago. Smoke filled the cabin, and that got him moving because smoke meant fire, and fire meant fuel, and fuel meant explosion. So he hit the harness release and fell hard to the deck that was now tilted at a crazy angle. Scrambling toward the emergency hatch that thankfully still worked, the hatch blew outward with a bang, and Daniel tumbled out into alien air that tasted wrong and smelled like copper and rotting plants, hitting dirt that was too red and too hard. Rolling away from the ship on instinct as flames started to lick up from the engine compartment, he made it maybe 20 meters before the first explosion hit. Not huge, but big enough to knock him flat and shower him with debris, followed by 2 more smaller ones that turned his research vessel into scattered junk and burning metal. Daniel lay on the ground and stared up at a sky that was the wrong color. 2 suns visible through the strange clouds. His mind trying to catch up with what had just happened while his body screamed at him about various injuries that he couldn't afford to think about. Yet a sound made him freeze, and it was like nothing he had heard before. A mix between a growl and a clicking that came from the forest edge maybe 40 meters away. And Daniel slowly turned his head to see what had made it. The creature stood as tall as a horse, but built like something between a big cat and a lizard. Scales that shifted colors to match the shadows. 6 legs ending in claws that looked sharp enough to cut steel. And a head full of teeth that no herbivore had ever needed. Daniel didn't move and barely breathed as the thing watched him, with eyes that had too much intelligence behind them, clearly deciding whether he was food or threat or something else entirely. 2 more of the creatures emerged from different parts of the forest, and Daniel realized with cold certainty that they had been waiting and watching, probably since before he crashed, and now they were closing in to investigate what the explosion had brought to their territory. He needed to move, but moving might trigger an attack. Needed to find shelter, but there was nowhere to go except back toward the burning ship or into the forest where more of these things probably waited. The first creature took a step forward and made that clicking growl again. The other 2 spreading out to flank him. And Daniel knew that doing nothing was the same as dying, so he slowly pushed himself up to his knees and then to his feet. His right leg didn't want to hold weight, and pain shot through his ribs when he breathed deep. But he stayed standing and backed toward the wreckage, where at least the fire might give him some protection. The creatures followed but stopped at the edge of the burning debris field, watching him with tilted heads that suggested confusion rather than fear. And Daniel realized they had probably never seen fire used as protection before. He scanned the wreckage as he backed into it, looking for anything useful. Spotting his emergency pack half buried under a twisted panel and his survey kit somehow intact against a rock, the creatures circled but didn't advance, seeming content to wait, and Daniel used that time to grab what he could reach. His pack and the survey kit, and a piece of metal that might work as a weapon if things got desperate. The sky was darkening fast. Too fast, and Daniel checked the chronometer on his wrist. That had somehow survived the crash. To see that night on this planet lasted only about 6 Earth hours, but came quick and hard. He needed shelter, and he needed it now because whatever these things were during the day, they might be worse at night. So he looked around frantically and spotted rocky terrain maybe 60 meters away. Cliff face with what looked like cave openings. The creatures saw where he was looking and moved to cut off that route. Working together with coordination that spoke of intelligence and pack hunting experience, Daniel picked up a piece of burning debris and threw it at the nearest creature, which jumped back with a startled hiss. And that gave him the opening he needed to run. His injured leg protested every step, but adrenaline pushed him forward. More creatures emerging from the forest as he ran, at least 7 or 8 of them now, all converging on him as the light died and the temperature started to drop. He made it to the rocks with them right behind him, found a cave opening barely big enough to crawl into, dragged himself inside with his pack and kit while claws scraped at the stone behind him. The cave went back maybe 4 meters and opened into a small chamber where he could sit up. And Daniel quickly pulled out his emergency supplies to see what he had to work with: survival blanket, water purification tablets, protein bars, first aid kit, flare gun with 3 flares, and most important right now, a fire starter that used chemical reaction instead of spark. Outside the cave, the creatures gathered, their clicking and growling filling the air. And the temperature was dropping so fast Daniel could see his breath misting in the dim light from outside. He gathered broken wood and dry plant material from the cave floor left by whatever had sheltered here before, arranged it carefully with shaking hands, and used the fire starter to get flames going. The fire caught and grew and threw light and heat into the small space. And Daniel heard the creatures outside go suddenly quiet, then retreat several steps. He fed the fire and made it bigger, pushing it toward the cave entrance, and watched as the creatures backed away further, staring at the flames with what looked like confusion and maybe fear. None of them had ever seen fire used like this before, he realized. Maybe he had never seen controlled fire at Alice. Full dark fell, and the temperature outside dropped to what his scanner said was -40. Daniel sat by his fire and watched the predators watching him, knowing that this tiny flame was the only thing keeping him alive on a planet where even the deadliest creatures in the galaxy struggled to survive. Daniel woke to find the fire burning low and dawn light creeping into the cave. His whole body stiff and aching from sleeping on stone and from injuries he hadn't had time to properly treat yet. But he was alive, and that counted for more than comfort. The creatures were still outside, and he could see them in the growing light. At least a dozen now, the scale pack hunters he had seen last night, joined by other things. Something that looked like a cross between a wolf and an insect, and a massive beast that moved on 4 legs and had armor plating that gleamed in the early sun. None of them had left during the night, and all of them watched the cave entrance with focused attention. That made Daniel's skin crawl, because animals didn't usually wait like this. They either attacked or moved on to easier prey. He fed more wood to the fire and watched their reactions. Saw how they shifted back when the flames grew higher. How their eyes tracked the smoke rising into the morning air. "You've never seen this before, have you?" Daniel said quietly, knowing they couldn't understand but needing to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. "Fire is completely new to you." That realization was both terrifying and useful. Terrifying because it meant this world had developed without one of the most basic tools that had shaped human evolution. And useful because it gave him an advantage that nothing here had adapted to counter. He took inventory of his supplies while the fire burned. His emergency pack had protein bars for maybe 5 days if he rationed carefully. Water purification tablets for 2 weeks. Basic medical supplies that he used now to wrap his ribs and bandage a cut on his arm that looked worse than it. Felt the survey kit held scanning equipment, sample containers, and most importantly right now, a small cutting laser that could be used for defense if he was desperate enough. Though its charge would only last for maybe 20 sustained shots, his communicator was smashed. The emergency beacon was somewhere in the wreckage, and probably just as broken. No way to call for help and no guarantee that help would even come to a restricted world like this. Daniel remembered the briefing about this planet from the navigation database. Cathara 7, designated as a nature preserve for dangerous species. Off limits to all but approved research teams. And even they rarely survived longer than a few hours on the surface. The Galactic Council had lost 3 survey teams here before declaring it too dangerous for further study. And that was with full technological support and orbital backup. He was one man with a fire and some basic supplies. And he needed a plan that went beyond hiding in a cave. The fire had burned down the immediate threat level. The creatures maintaining distance but not leaving. And Daniel realized he needed to establish a larger perimeter if he wanted to survive long. Enough to matter, he gathered his courage and his pack, kept the fire burning with a pile of wood at the cave entrance, and crawled out into the morning light with a burning branch held in front of him. Like a weapon, the creatures backed away as he emerged, their eyes fixed on the flames, and Daniel moved slowly and deliberately. Not running but not showing fear either. Walking like he owned this space. He made it to the crash site where the ship had burned down to twisted metal and broken components. The fire here long since gone cold, and he started gathering what he could use, pieces of hull plating that could serve as tools or shields. Wiring that might be useful for traps. An intact fuel cell that still showed half charge, and most valuable, 3 more emergency packs that had been thrown clear of the main explosion. The creatures watched from a distance of about 20 meters, never taking their eyes off him or the burning branch he carried. And Daniel worked fast because he didn't know how long their caution would last. He made 3 trips back to the cave, each time carrying supplies and maintaining the fire. And by midday, he had doubled his resources and started to form a real plan. The cave was defensible, but limiting. He needed to expand his safe zone and gather food and water. The scanner showed a water source about 200 meters to the west, but getting there meant crossing open ground with predators. All around, Daniel spent the afternoon experimenting with fire, building small fires in a ring around the cave entrance. Watching how the creatures reacted to each new flame. They didn't like it, but they also didn't leave. And he realized they were studying him as much as he was studying them. These weren't simple animals acting on instinct. They were intelligent enough to recognize something new and important. The largest of the pack hunters, the ones with scales that shifted colors, seemed to be the leaders. And one in particular kept closer than the others. A specimen that was maybe younger or more curious. Watching everything Daniel did with tilted head and clicking sounds that might have been communication. "What do you think of this?" Daniel asked the creature, feeding wood to the nearest fire and making the flames jump higher. And the thing jumped back but then crept forward again, fascinated despite its caution. He named it Scout in his head, because it seemed to be the one most willing to test the boundaries. And having a name for at least one of the things trying to decide whether to eat him made the situation feel slightly less hopeless. By late afternoon, Daniel had established 5 fire pits in a rough circle around the cave, each burning steady and creating a zone maybe 15 meters across that the creatures wouldn't enter. He used the time to treat his injuries properly. His ribs were bruised but not broken. His leg was strained but functional. Various cuts and burns that would heal if infection didn't set in. The protein bars tasted like cardboard and chemicals, but they had calories, and that was what mattered. He ate one and drank water purified from what he had collected from morning condensation on the rocks. As the second night approached and the temperature started its rapid drop, Daniel prepared for another long cold vigil, feeding all 5 fires and making sure he had enough wood to last until morning. The creatures settled into watching positions, more of them now than before. Word had apparently spread that something interesting was happening in this territory. Scout and its pack stayed closest. The big-scaled hunters that Daniel was starting to think of as razorbacks because of the ridge of spikes along their spines. Watching the fires with what looked almost like wonder, a new sound made everyone freeze, and it came from deeper in the forest. A roar that was deep enough to vibrate in Daniel's chest and loud enough to scatter some of the smaller predators. The razorbacks didn't run, but they shifted nervously, moving closer together and making low warning sounds to each other. And Scout actually moved closer to the fire ring, as if recognizing that the flames offered protection from whatever had made that sound. Daniel checked his scanner and felt his blood run cold when he saw the reading. Something massive moving through the forest toward his position, bigger than anything he had seen so far. And the scanner's database identified it with a threat level that flashed Recatheran apex predator. The screen said, species classification unknown. Estimated mass 800 kilograms. Known to attack and destroy research teams regardless of defensive technology. Well, that's just perfect, Daniel muttered, feeding more wood to the fires and making them burn as high as he could. Nothing like attracting the biggest monster on the planet. The roar came again, closer now, and the razorbacks formed a defensive circle with Scout at the center. All of them facing toward the sound. Daniel realized with surprise that they weren't running, and they weren't attacking him. They were defending this position, maybe because the fires offered protection they had never had before, or maybe because they had decided that what he represented was valuable enough to protect. The massive predator emerged from the forest, and it was everything the scanner had promised and worse. Built like an earth tiger, crossed with a bear and covered in armor plates, with claws that looked long enough to disembowel him in one swipe. It stopped at the edge of the fire ring and stared at the flames, with eyes that held far too much intelligence, calculating and considering, clearly trying to decide if this barrier was real or could be crossed. Daniel stood and moved toward the nearest fire, grabbing a burning branch and holding it out toward the creature, making himself look bigger and more threatening than he felt. Not today, he said firmly, keeping his voice strong, even though his heart hammered against his ribs. This is my territory now, and these fires say you need to go somewhere else. The apex predator growled low and dangerous, took one step forward that made all the razorbacks tense, and Daniel thrust the burning branch toward it while pulling a flare from his pack with his other hand. Fired the flare straight up, and it burst into brilliant red light overhead, painting everything in crimson and making the apex predator flinch back with a surprised snarl. The creature stared at him for a long moment, and Daniel stared back. Human and alien predator, locked in a contest of wills across a barrier of fire that only one of them truly understood. Then the apex predator turned and melted back into the forest, moving silent despite its size, leaving Daniel shaking with adrenaline and the razorbacks clicking to each other in what sounded almost like Relief Scout approached closer than it ever had before, stopping just outside the fire ring, and made a sound that was different from the others. Softer and almost questioning, Daniel sat down heavily by the nearest fire and laughed. The sound slightly hysterical but real. 3 days on Kethra 7 had taught Daniel more about survival than any training program ever could. And he had settled into a routine that kept him alive, even if it barely qualified as living. Wake before dawn to rebuild the fires. Scout the immediate area for supplies and food. Maintain the perimeter. And never ever let the flames die completely. The Razorbacks had become constant companions. Scout and its pack of 8 others that Daniel had started thinking of as his unlikely guardians. They didn't come close enough to touch, but they also didn't leave. Maintaining a watch rotation that kept predators away from his fire ring, he had learned which local plants were edible by watching what the Razorbacks ate and testing tiny amounts on himself, and found a route to the water source that was defendable with portable fire pits, and had even managed to create crude tools from shipwreckage and fire-hardened wood. The fire had become everything. Warmth and protection and tool and weapon, and Daniel fed it constantly with wood gathered from the forest edges. Always careful to maintain sight of at least one burning pit scout, had grown bolder over the days, accepting food that Daniel left near the fire ring. Dried meat from prey that the Razorbacks had brought down and that Daniel cooked over his flames. The creature seemed fascinated by the transformation that cooking created. Raw flesh becoming something different through heat and smoke. On the 4th morning, Daniel woke to find Scout sitting just outside the main fire pit, closer than it had ever been, watching him with eyes that held unmistakable curiosity rather than hunger. "Morning," Daniel said quietly, moving slowly as he added wood to the fire. "You're up early." Scout clicked softly and tilted its head, following his movements, and Daniel realized this was a test of sorts. The creature deciding whether the human was truly safe or just temporarily useful. He went about his morning routine with Scout watching everything, preparing food and eating, checking his supplies which were running lower than he liked, treating minor wounds that had accumulated from working in the harsh environment when he cooked a piece of meat over the fire. The smell drew Scout even closer, and on impulse Daniel cut off a portion and tossed it toward the creature. Not close enough to seem aggressive, but within easy reach. Scout sniffed the cooked meat, looked at Daniel, then carefully picked it up and ate it, its eyes widening slightly at the taste. "Different from raw, isn't it?" Daniel said, cooking another piece for himself. "Humans figured this out maybe 500,000 years ago. One of our first big innovations." Over the next hour, he cooked several more pieces, each time tossing one to Scout, and the Razorback accepted each offering, moving incrementally closer until it was sitting just on the other side of the fire. The other Razorbacks watched from their positions around the perimeter, clearly uncertain about their packmates' behavior, but not interfering. That afternoon brought a new challenge when Daniel's scanner picked up atmospheric changes that suggested a major storm system moving in, and his database search confirmed his fears. Kethra 7 experienced violent storms every 5 to 7 days that brought winds strong enough to uproot trees and rain that was mildly acidic. The storm would hit before nightfall, and it would last at least 12 hours. And keeping fires alive through that would be nearly impossible. Daniel worked frantically to prepare, moving supplies into the cave, gathering wood and storing it where it might stay dry, building shelters over his fire pits using hull plating and rock scout. Watched for a while, then made clicking sounds to the other Razorbacks. And to Daniel's amazement, they began helping, dragging large branches to his woodpile, moving rocks to reinforce his shelters, working with coordination that spoke of intelligence and understanding. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Daniel said as he worked alongside them. "And you're helping because you know the fires matter, The sky darkened fast, purple clouds rolling in like living things. And the wind picked up until it howled through the rocks and bent trees that had stood for what must have been centuries. Daniel retreated to the cave with as much wood as he could fit, building the fire near the entrance, but protected from the wind, and Scout followed him inside. The other Razorbacks taking shelter in crevices and behind rocks nearby. The storm hit like a physical blow. Rain that stung exposed skin and wind that screamed loud enough to hurt his ears. And Daniel fought to keep the fire alive as Gus tried to blow it out and Rain tried to drown it. Fed it constantly, using his body as a shield, rearranging the wood to create better airflow, adding the precious fuel from his emergency supplies when regular wood wouldn't stay lit hours, passed in a blur of smoke and effort. His eyes burning and his lungs aching. But the fire lived, and that was what mattered. Scout pressed against the back wall of the cave, watching with what Daniel could have sworn was concern. And when a particularly strong gust scattered the fire, Daniel heard the creature make a distressed sound. "It's okay," he gasped, rebuilding the flames with shaking hands. "I've got this. Humans are good at keeping fires alive. It's kind of our thing." The storm raged through the night and into the next day. 12 hours of constant battle against wind and water and the cold that crept in whenever the fire burned low. Daniel's supplies of easy fuel ran out, and he had to rely solely on the wood he had gathered, which was getting damp despite his precautions. But he made it work through sheer determination and techniques he half remembered from survival training. When the storm finally broke and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, Daniel collapsed beside the fire that still burned. Exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced, Scout moved closer and made a soft clicking sound. And Daniel looked up to see the Razorback staring at him with something that looked almost like respect. Outside the cave, the other Razorbacks emerged from their shelters, and Daniel realized all of them had stayed through the storm, protecting the perimeter even in conditions that could have killed them. He crawled to the cave entrance and looked out at devastation. Trees down everywhere, the landscape reshaped by wind and rain. Several of his fire pits destroyed, and others barely smoldering. But the main fire lived, and that was enough to start over the next 2 days. Daniel rebuilt his defenses with the Razorbacks working alongside him more openly now. They brought wood without being asked, helped move rocks for better shelter construction. And Scout stayed close enough that Daniel could have reached out and touched its scales if he had been brave or foolish enough to try. He demonstrated more uses for fire, showing them how to harden wood by slowly burning it, how to use hot rocks to boil water, how to create char that could be used for marking territory. The Razorbacks learned quickly, and Daniel realized he was teaching them, passing on knowledge that humans had developed over thousands of years. And they were absorbing it with intelligence that would have shocked the Galactic Council scientists who considered them simple predators. On the 7th day, Daniel's scanner picked up movement from deeper in the forest, something large approaching his territory. And the readings made his stomach drop. Not the apex predator from before, but something even worse according to the database. A shadow worm. The creature that had destroyed entire research teams and was considered unkillable by conventional weapon Scout and the pack leader. A scarred Razorback that Daniel called Boss. Both made warning sounds and gathered the pack into defensive positions. Daniel checked his supplies and felt fear settle in his chest. He had the cutting laser with maybe 15 shots left, 3 flares and fire, against something that the database said could survive direct hits from plasma weapons. The shadow worm emerged from the forest as night began to fall, and it was massive, easily 3 times the size of the apex predator, with dark scales that seemed to absorb light and eyes that glowed with bioluminescence. It moved with terrible grace, clearly intelligent and clearly hunting. and its gaze fixed on the fire ring with interest rather than fear. Daniel stood and faced it across the flames. Human and monster sizing each other up, and he knew that everything came down to this moment. "All right," he said quietly, feeding wood to the fires and making them burn higher. "Let's see if you've ever met something that fights back with the oldest weapon in human history." Scout moved to stand beside him on the safe side of the fire and made a challenging sound. The other Razorbacks spreading out to support positions. And Daniel realized they were preparing to fight alongside him. He had survived a crash, endured killing cold, weathered a storm that destroyed landscapes, and built an alliance with predators using nothing but fire and determination. Now, he would find out if that was enough against a creature that evolution had designed to be unstoppable. The shadow worm circled the fire ring slowly, its massive form moving with fluid grace that belied its size. And Daniel tracked it with his eyes while his mind raced through possibilities and strategies. This creature had survived encounters with plasma weapons and military-grade defensive systems. It had destroyed research teams with full technological support. And now it faced one human with fire and desperation. Scout stayed close to Daniel's side, while Boss directed the other Razorbacks into a coordinated formation. They had fought together as a pack before, but never like this. Never with fire as part of their tactics, and never with a human guiding their strategy. "We need to make it respect the flames," Daniel said quietly, knowing they couldn't understand his words but hoping his tone conveyed confidence. "Show it that this isn't just light and heat. It's a weapon." He grabbed a sturdy branch and wrapped cloth from his emergency pack around one end, soaking it with fuel from the ship's reserves, then thrust it into the nearest fire until it blazed. The shadow worm paused in its circling, eyes fixed on the torch, clearly trying to determine what this new element meant. Daniel stepped forward to the edge of the fire ring and thrust the torch toward the creature, making it flare brighter, and the worm pulled back slightly. More from curiosity than fear. It had probably encountered fire before in nature. Lightning strikes and volcanic vents, but never fire used as a tool and weapon. Never flames controlled and directed by intent. Scout made a clicking sound and suddenly grabbed a burning branch in its jaws, mimicking Daniel's action, and the other Razorbacks followed suit. 8 creatures now holding fire like weapons they had been using all their lives. The shadow worm's eyes narrowed, and it moved faster, testing the perimeter, looking for a weakness in the ring of flames. Daniel ran to intercept, thrusting his torch low to block the approach, and Scout moved with him, the two of them working together like they had trained for this. The worm struck fast, one massive claw sweeping toward Daniel, and he rolled under it while bringing the torch up to catch the creature's scaled belly. The flames connected, and the shadow worm made a sound Daniel had never heard before. Surprise mixed with pain, pulling back and staring at the burned spot on its armor. "That's right," Daniel said, breathing hard. "Fire doesn't care how tough your scales are. Heat goes through everything." The creature circled again, but more cautiously now, reassessing. And Daniel used the time to prepare his next move. He ran to the cave and grabbed the fuel cell from the ship. It still had half a charge, and he could rig it to overload, create an explosion, or at least a massive burst of flame. Scout followed him and made questioning sounds, watching as he worked with the cell's manual override panel. "Worst-case backup plan," Daniel explained, setting the cell aside but ready. "If it gets past the fires, we need something bigger." The Razorbacks maintained their positions, holding burning branches and creating a wall of fire that moved and adapted. And the shadow worm began testing different approaches, feinting left, then attacking right. Trying to break their coordination. Boss led the pack responses perfectly, directing Razorbacks to reinforce weak points. And Daniel realized the creature was learning their tactics. Each failed approach teaching it something new. They needed to change strategy before the worm figured out how to counter. Then Daniel grabbed several of the emergency flares from his pack and distributed them around the perimeter, setting them up as trip markers. If the worm crossed certain lines, he could trigger them and create massive bursts of light and flame. The creature tested the left side again, and one razorback's branch went out, creating a gap, and the worm surged forward to exploit it. Daniel fired a flare directly at the creature's face, and it exploded in brilliant light, the shadow worm recoiling with a roar that shook the ground scout, and two others rushed to fill the gap with fresh torches while Daniel repositioned to cover them. This was working, but barely. They were holding the line, but it was costing them. The Razorbacks couldn't maintain this intensity forever, and Daniel's supplies were finite. The shadow worm seemed to realize this too, settling into a patient crouch just outside the fire ring, waiting for exhaustion or mistakes to give it an opening. Night deepened, and the temperature dropped. Daniel fed the main fires to keep them high, but conserved his portable fuel, knowing he might need it for a final desperate push-out. Brought him water in a container they had fashioned from ship parts, and Daniel drank gratefully, amazed at how far they had come in just 7 days. The other Razorbacks rotated positions to rest, maintaining the perimeter while giving each member of the pack time to recover. And Daniel saw military discipline in their movements that spoke of intelligence and adaptability. Hours passed in tense standoff, the shadow worm watching and waiting, the defenders maintaining their wall of fire. And Daniel's mind worked on the problem. They couldn't win through endurance. The worm could wait days if needed, so they needed to drive it off permanently or convince it that attacking wasn't worth the coasting. Idea formed, and it was risky, but might be their only chance. Daniel started building a larger fire in the center of the ring, using all the wood he could spare, creating a blaze that reached higher than any they had made before. Scout watched with interest as the flames climbed, heat radiating out in waves, and the other Razorbacks added wood without being asked. The shadow worm stirred uneasily as the central fire grew, clearly uncomfortable with the increasing heat and light. When the fire was burning at its peak, Daniel grabbed the fuel cell and moved toward the edge of the ring on the side closest to the worm. "This is going to be loud," he warned Scout, who tilted its head but stayed close. Daniel activated the cell's overload sequence, set the timer for 30 seconds, and hurled it toward the shadow worm with all his strength. The creature dodged, but the cell landed close enough, and when it exploded, the blast was everything Daniel had hoped for. A massive fireball that lit up the night like a small sun and sent waves of heat rolling across the landscape. The shadow worm screamed and scrambled back, scales smoking from the thermal assault, and Daniel pressed the advantage, leading the Razorbacks forward with torches blazing. They advanced as a unit, human and aliens working together, driving the wounded and shocked creature back toward the forest. The worm fought, but without full commitment, clearly deciding this prey was too dangerous and too organized, finally turning and crashing into the forest with speed that suggested real fear. Daniel and the Razorbacks pursued to the tree line, making noise and waving fire, ensuring the message was clear. This territory was defended, and the cost of attacking was too high. When they were sure the worm was gone, they returned to the fire ring, and Daniel collapsed beside the central fire. Exhausted and shaking with adrenaline, Crash Scout sat beside him and made a sound that was almost gentle, pressing its scaled shoulder against his arm in what might have been comfort or gratitude or simple companionship. The other Razorbacks gathered around, and for a moment they all sat together in the firelight, 8 predators and 1 human, having achieved something that should have been impossible. Daniel looked up at the alien stars and laughed. "The sound tired but genuine. We did it," he said to Scout. To all of them, "We actually did it." His scanner, forgotten until now, began beeping with an alert, and when Daniel checked it, his heart jumped. Incoming ship. The display read, "Galactic Council Research Vessel. ETA 4 hours rescue was coming." and he had survived long enough to see it. But as he looked at Scout and the other Razorbacks gathered around the fire, he realized this had become about more than just survival in 7 days. He had built something new, an alliance between species using the oldest human tool. And that meant something that would echo far beyond this planet. He fed more wood to the fire and settled in to wait for dawn and rescue, surrounded by predators who had become partners. On a world where only the strongest survived and humans had proven once again that their strength came not from teeth or claws, but from the ability to make fire bend to their will. The rescue ship descended through Kethera 7's atmosphere with careful precision, its sensors sweeping the surface for any sign of the crashed research vessel. And Daniel watched it approach from beside his central fire pit, Scout sitting at his side like they had been partners for years instead of days. Ship was a standard Galactic Council research vessel, sleek and efficient, designed to extract personnel from hostile environments quickly and safely. And it circled the crash site twice before finding a clear landing zone about 50 meters from Daniel's fire ring. He had spent the last 4 hours preparing for this moment, banking the fires so they would burn steady but not threatening, positioning the Razorbacks so they wouldn't seem aggressive, trying to make the scene look as safe as possible, while knowing that nothing about this situation was going to make sense to the rescue team. The ship settled with a hiss of landing thrusters and a ramp extended. 3 figures in environmental suits emerging with weapons ready and scanning equipment. Active Daniel stood and raised his hands to show he was unarmed, calling out in standard Galactic, "Daniel Carter. Research designation 742 Alpha, requesting extraction." The lead figure, a Zentari by the look of the suit's proportions, stopped and stared, clearly not expecting to find anyone alive, much less standing calmly in the middle of what sensors must be showing as a death zone packed with predators. "Carter?" The Zentari's voice came through suit speakers, female and shocked. "You've been missing for 7 days. Our sensors show multiple apex predators in your immediate vicinity. You need to get to the ship now." "I appreciate the concern," Daniel said, staying calm. "But I'm not in immediate danger, and we need to talk about what's happened here before anyone does anything hasty." The second figure, wearing a suit marked with medical insignia, moved forward with a scanner raised. His vitals are stressed but stable. No signs of immediate trauma. This doesn't make sense. He should be dead or dying. Scout made a low clicking sound, and the rescue team all jumped, weapons coming up, and Daniel quickly moved between them and the Razorback. "Stop. Don't shoot. They're not hostile," he said firmly. "These creatures have been protecting me. We have an understanding." The third team member, whose suit identified him as Commander Kelvin Ross, human like Daniel, spoke with authority. "Carter, you're clearly experiencing some form of trauma-induced delusion. Those are Kethran Razorbacks. They're classified as extremely dangerous predators. They don't protect humans." "They do now," Daniel replied, gesturing to the fire ring and the arranged territory. "And it's not a delusion, it's fire. They've never encountered controlled fire before, and it changed everything." He spent the next 20 minutes explaining while the rescue team scanned and recorded and tried to process what they were seeing. Scout and the pack maintaining careful distance, but clearly watching. Daniel, with what even the skeptical team had to admit looked like concern. The medical officer, whose name was Lisa Park, kept running scans on both Daniel and the Razorbacks, her voice filled with disbelief as she reported, "The predators show elevated stress hormones consistent with protective behavior. They're watching us like we're threats to Carter. This is unprecedented." Commander Ross approached one of the fire pits carefully, studying it with professional interest. "You built this from crash salvage and local materials?" "Fire starter from my emergency pack to get it going. Then just wood and maintenance," Daniel explained. "The Razorbacks learned to help. They understand cause and effect. They're intelligent enough to recognize tools and adapt their behavior. The Zentari, who introduced herself as Dr. Senevex, was recording everything with multiple devices. The Council needs to see this. We lost 3 teams on this planet, 17 researchers dead. And you survived with primitive fire technology. Fire isn't primitive, Daniel said quietly. It's the foundation of human civilization. We've been using it for 500,000 years. The fact that species with advanced technology don't recognize its value doesn't make it less effective. Scout moved closer, still cautious of the suited figures, and made a soft sound directed at Daniel, who responded without thinking. It's okay. They're here to help. The rescue team exchanged glances, and Dr. Vex spoke carefully. You understand that creature? Not words, but intent and tone. Yes, Daniel admitted. We've been communicating for days. Basic stuff, but enough to coordinate. They're not simple animals. They're capable of learning and reasoning. Commander Ross made a decision. We need to extract you for medical evaluation, but I'm authorizing extended observation of this site. The Council will want full documentation. This changes our understanding of both Catherine fauna and human survival capabilities. Over the next hour, they packed Daniel's meager supplies and documented the fire ring's construction. Dr. Vex recording Scout's behavior as the Razorbacks stayed close to Daniel throughout the process. When it came time to leave, Daniel approached Scout and the pack, knowing this might be the last time he saw them. Thank you, he said simply, placing his hand on the ground between them in what had become their gesture of peaceful intent. You saved my life as much as I saved yours. Scout tilted its head and clicked softly, pressing its nose close to Daniel's hand but not quite touching. And the other Razorbacks gathered around in what looked unmistakably like a farewell. We can't take them with us, Commander Ross said gently. They belong here, and removing them would violate preserve protocols. I know, Daniel replied. But I want to come back, not to study them like specimens, but to continue what we started. They're intelligent enough for real communication, and maybe even alliance. Dr. Vex was already making notes. I'll recommend a research proposal. This is too important to ignore. If Catherine's team learned tool use and cooperation from one human in 7 days, imagine what's possible with dedicated contact. The medical officer cleared Daniel for travel, and they moved toward the ship, Scout and the pack following at a distance. And Daniel turned back one last time to see them sitting around the fire ring he had built. The fire still burned and would continue burning as long as the wood lasted. A marker of something new on a world of ancient predators. Proof that even the oldest human innovation could change everything on the ship. As they broke atmosphere and Kethra 7 fell away below, Daniel sat for a medical examination while Commander Ross debriefed him, and Dr. Vex compiled her preliminary report. The Council is going to have questions, Ross said, reading through Daniel's account. You survived using methods that predate space travel by hundreds of thousands of years. Humans are from a death world too, Daniel replied. Earth made us adapt or die for millions of years. We learned fire because we needed it to survive predators and cold and darkness. Those lessons don't disappear just because we built starships. Lisa Park finished her scans and shook her head in amazement. You're dehydrated and undernourished. You have bruised ribs and multiple minor injuries. But you're in better condition than survivors from planets rated 1/10 as dangerous. How is that possible? Because I treated it seriously from the start, Daniel explained. No assumptions about being rescued quickly. No relying on technology that was destroyed. Just basic survival principles and the knowledge that humans have survived worse. Dr. Vex looked up from her datapad. Your fire techniques, the way you used heat for tools and protection and cooking. The Razorbacks learned all of it? Basic versions, yes, Daniel confirmed. They watched me harden wood in fire and started doing it themselves. They saw cooked food and understood it was different from raw. They're not just intelligent. They're adaptable, which means every assumption we made about Catherine Fauna needs revision, she said, excitement clear in her voice. And every survival protocol for Death World operations needs to include low-tech options. Commander Ross leaned back. The Council designated Kethra 7 as unsurvivable after losing 3 teams with full equipment. And you made it 7 days with a fire starter and determination. That's going to shake up a lot of comfortable assumptions. The ship's eye chimed with an incoming transmission, and Ross accepted it. A hologram of a council official, appearing with the formal bearing of bureaucracy. Commander Ross, we've received your preliminary report and find it difficult to credit. 1 human survived on Kethra 7 using only primitive fire technology? Not primitive, sir, Daniel interrupted before Ross could respond. Fire is sophisticated technology that requires understanding of chemistry, material properties, and thermodynamics. Humans have been refining fire use for 500,000 years. The official blinked at being corrected. Regardless, the Council wants full debriefing upon your arrival. And we're temporarily upgrading Kethra 7's research status to allow follow-up studies. I want to lead those studies, Daniel said firmly. I have established relationship with the native Razorbacks. Removing me from the equation would waste everything we learned. The official hesitated, clearly not used to rescued personnel making demands. But Dr. Vex spoke up. The survivor has valid points. His rapport with Catherine Fauna is unprecedented and irreplaceable. I recommend his proposal be given serious consideration. After some back and forth, the official agreed to present Daniel's case to the Council Committee. And the transmission ended. Ross looked at Daniel with something like respect. You know they're going to study you as much,